How important is it to have a guru? How do you know who your guru is? It just reminds me of one time with Richard Fish in the UK. He was doing a Kriya Yoga meditation retreat, initiation retreat, and I spoke at it, but I spoke about how I found the path of Kriya Yoga and how I ended up receiving instruction in my relationship with Roy. And in it, I ended up talking about how with Roy, it wasn't really like, if you've read Autobiography of a Yogi, you know that Paramahansa Yogananda talks about when he met Sri Yukteswar, and it's very dramatic. It's very, it would make a very good movie scene. And with Roy, it wasn't really like that. I remember I was in one of the chalets that were on the grounds of CSA, and I had never met the man in person, but I had been in communication with him for several years. And I was on the grounds. I had arrived outside of retreat times, and I was in the chalet, and then this woman who was tending to the chalets, she came, and with her, to help her do the cleaning, was this very, very tall man, easily 6'7" or 6'5". Roy?
Oh, right.
Yeah.
He was pretty tall, yeah.
And he walked in, and he was towering over everybody. And so then Barbara introduced me, and it was Roy. And so it was some man who was just helping her to clean the chalets was the man who I had considered to be my future guru. And it was, I suppose, what you might consider very underwhelming in comparing to how Yogananda talked about it in the Autobiography of a Yogi. But for me, it was very significant because there's so much mystery there, so much that I don't know. And I had an idea that this person was going to help me to know. And so how did I know that he was my guru? And this is what became interesting, because as I was explaining it to the people in the UK during that retreat, they one lady just kind of said, "So is Roy your guru?" And I kind of said, "Well, yeah, like that's the person I've been relying on for all these teachings. So why wouldn't he be my guru?" It's kind of, guru means teacher. You know, we can get all fancy and we can talk about many different layers of what guru means. But essentially, Roy was the person who was there as a representative of a tradition of teaching, who I relied upon to deliver that teaching in a structured, systematic way, which made sense to me. So for me, he was my guru. And then I remember during while I was there was a woman there, and she said, you can't just take it as a given that you're Roy's disciple, and I was still a little naive about things. So I remember going up to Roy after one of the retreats, after one of the meditations in the morning, and I just wanted to be sure that he saw me the way I saw him. And I said, "Roy, can I be your disciple?" He said, "Well, yeah, of course." But it wasn't because he had an expectation of me to do anything or to be anyone or subscribe to his version of reality or anything like that. It was more, here's a teaching I'm offering you, and I'll be here to support you with that teaching. And that's pretty much what Roy was about. And so I applied the teaching, and he saw I was applying the teaching. I spent summers in CSA. So he was willing to invest in me to the degree that I was willing to invest in the process. And there was no real hullabalooza about how the details of how he lived his life and the specifics of what he did at the weekend and all these kind of things. It was all about the teaching and about the practice. So when it asks here, how important, first of all, how do you know who your guru is? I suppose you make the decision. You make the decision who you feel you can rely on, who's a worthy person to get this information from, and you decide. And you have to trust your decision. And like Ryan talked about the other day, sometimes you get to a point and you say, maybe that wasn't the best decision. But you really have to give it your all to find that out. You can't just be, as Roy used to say, shopping around, because then you're not really giving anybody the opportunity. So if you come across somebody who seems to be delivering something which is meaningful, that you feel like it makes sense to you, they seem sincere in what they're doing, and it's something you can apply and test for yourself, and then afterwards, if you feel like the results are kind of being supportive and beneficial, then why would you give it up? You just keep on going with that, and it kind of goes like that. And how important is it to have a guru? Well, I think the guru is in life itself. We're going to get teachings in all different ways. And we talked about tapas yesterday, the self-discipline and having to live through difficult experience. So life itself, or God itself, is the guru. But life has many different expressions, and so there's, we have a conversation with somebody, and there's something communicated which gets at us. In that there's a teaching. In that there's an experience of having to go through tapas and discipline ourselves to navigate the tension of that experience. So we always have teachings coming to us in lots of different ways. But having somebody or a source that's supportive in our being able to adhere to a specific practice, I think from my own experience, it was very useful. Because it stopped me from shopping around and trying out lots of different approaches and lots of different techniques, getting involved in lots of different philosophical, outlines, because even though people make comparisons between Buddhism and yoga and Christianity and different things, and we do this kind of overlapping, which is, it can be fun to do, but it can also, if we do that continuously, we're kind of mixing concepts. And although there's similarity in concepts, they're not always explained the same way, and the terminology can be different, and how it's been referenced in terms of the whole system can be different. And so there may be parallels that we can draw, but to do that when we're still endeavoring to move deeper into being able to just become our own, reliant on our own capacity to discern and discriminate, we can put in so much information that it clouds our judgment and it causes more confusion. So I think having a guru is demonstrative of our being aligned to a specific teaching, and then being aligned to that specific teaching, we have more clarity in what we should be doing. And having more clarity in what we should be doing, we're able to assess if we're doing it and if we're applying it, and we're able to measure how it's benefiting us. So to answer the two questions in a more succinct manner, how important is it to have a guru? I think it's quite important. How do you know who your guru is? You decide. And that's it. Want something to add?
I could add something.
Yeah, go ahead.
So what was the first question again?
How important is it to have a guru?
That was the first one?
Yeah.
Okay. I think it's very important. But I think that it is very important to have a teacher in anything that you want to accomplish. And that might be because I'm not one of those people that can just pick things up on my own. I have a cousin who's a brilliant guitar player, never took a lesson, and he can run rings around some of these professional guitar players. That wasn't me. I needed a teacher. I also like to know that I'm following a path that works. So for example, the fellow that I weight train with, why do I like weight training with him? Because he's knowledgeable, he's consistent, and I know that I can trust what he's saying. I don't have him explain anything to me, I just do what he says. That's just how I work. When I've learned a musical instrument, the same thing. I would try to find the best, most knowledgeable person I could. And if she said, you're going to be practicing scales for the next 6 months, even though I can already do more than that, I'm going to practice scales for the next 6 months, because that's how I function. For me, it was very important to have Mr. Davis in my life from a young age, because I, maybe like David, could have gone off on all kinds of different tangents, because I was interested in different philosophies. I was a thinker, I was an analyzer, I was interested in occult sciences, psychology. I really wanted to get to the nitty-gritty bottom of everything. And so I could have, turned my attention to all these different ways of thinking and understanding, and I would have gotten lost probably. But when I started reading Mr. Davis's books and Yogananda's books and Sri Yukteswar's, I knew that if I just stuck to what is in this and I followed it, that I'm going to be able to know what they knew. Same thing with the teacher of mine whom I learned Sanskrit from. He has a profound understanding of the Yoga Sutras. He has one book that he wrote that is something like 80 or 90 pages long. It's that thick. I read that book constantly. I go back to it, I read it again. I go back to it, I read it again, because there's so much in those few pages that I know that if I just keep studying this little bit, it's going to be very impactful for me. And that's been true. So much so that while we don't have a lot of interaction, I've contacted him enough saying, this is my 10th time reading the book. I've discovered this little nuance. And he would affirm, that's good, I'm glad you were able to see that. That now he refers people to me compared to all of his other students who actually went through trainings with him, because he says, if you've read the book that many times, and if you're actually applying what's in there, you know enough to share it as well. So Mr. Davis and the gurus, the teachers that I've had in my life are very helpful. And also, when it comes to the idea of who is your guru, was that the next one?
How do you know?
How do you know? Yeah. So when I met Mr. Davis, I had a distinct knowing. Like I got all teary and was just sort of overwhelmed by the sense of being home. Even though after that meditation, when I had that sense of being home, I went up to shake his hand and he waved it away and just gave me a hug and said, I'm glad you're here. And then he just moved on and talked to everyone else. There was no big deal going on. But I knew at that time that it was an important relationship. However, I didn't necessarily consider him to be my teacher at that point, because at that point, I just wanted to learn the techniques. I wanted to know how to do it. And then maybe about 2 or 3 years later, I asked him, I said, well, will you be my teacher? And he said, I will play that role for you in this lifetime. And I think having that dynamic of asking is important, because as you know, in our current era, there are all kinds of people on the internet. There are all kinds of books available. And it's easy to say, oh, I've been watching this guy's videos for 10 years, he's my teacher. It's easy to say that. And in a way, that person is your teacher because you're learning from them. But if they have no idea who you are, how can you have any kind of meaningful relationship? That's like saying, I'm married to Nicole Kidman. I love Nicole Kidman. I think she's a beautiful person. But me watching all of her movies and I've never met her before and saying, that's who I'm married to, does that make it real? No. And in my experience, I've also found that it's important to recognize the rapport that you have with the teacher. I have some students that I can barely talk to, and somehow they understand what I mean. And I find out the progress they have made just by applying what things I've said on YouTube or in my books. To me, that is a good rapport. I have other students who've been around for years, and occasionally they say to me, well, I don't really do the techniques you practice, but you're still my teacher. Or they say things like, I'm really more into Buddhism than Kriya Yoga, but you're still my teacher. I'm thinking, I really don't think you are. Not that I care that they're doing different things, but in order for us to have a relationship, I need to understand what you are doing. For example, I recently got another comment today on YouTube, and this one was actually all right, where they were asking me a question about a process. And I was following it until we got to the end, where they said, I have been studying and this book on Kriya Yoga. But the problem is, and this is the issue with Kriya Yoga in the current time, is that those books like there might be good stuff in there, but they don't tell you who they are. You can't find them. You can't have a real relationship with them so they can actually help you. So it's important to recognize that you have to find a teacher that, number one, is willing to look at you and decide, do we have the capacity to actually understand each other? Can we have the rapport? Number two, do you have the capacity to listen, to trust, and have that back and forth? Just like if you're in any kind of relationship, healthy relationship. So in my mind, the idea of how do you know who your teacher is number one, who inspires you? Number two, are you able to have access to them? Number three, do you have rapport such that you understand them? So much so that even when they say something that you might not quite jive with, you're willing to at least trust them to try it out. Just like in relationships, personal relationships, I have quite a few friends, and hardly any of them are interested in spirituality. But the thing I appreciate about those relationships is that we are open with each other. When we disagree, we can talk through it, we can move through it, and there is no loss of connection there. The same thing with myself and David and Donelle and a few other Kriya Yoga teachers that I know, and Mr. Davis. There is always this capacity to have mutual respect for each other, but to also be okay if we challenged each other. So this is kind of a passionate topic for me, and this is the reason why I created the Kriya Yoga Discipleship course, because I had students who were saying, "You're my teacher, I'm your student." And when I would talk to them, they weren't doing anything that I was talking about. And I said, well, take the course and then you'll understand what my relationship was like to Mr. Davis, what I interpreted his relationship was like to Yogananda, and so on. And then you can decide for yourself, is this a real relationship we can have? Because in order to benefit from this connection through the lineage, we have to have a real relationship. I need to know you, or a teacher needs to know you. You need to be in the teacher's consciousness. And then the teacher needs to be in your consciousness. Just like in relationships, if you're married to someone or in a deep relationship with them, you actually have to be able to see what it's like living day to day with them, and to see if you can maintain love through that as well. So I think that's my take on how you know who your guru is. And as I mentioned when we were, I was talking to some folks at lunch, I've been fairly lucky in that regard. When I met Mr. Davis, I just knew it, and it worked. We had some rocky patches that we had to grow through, but we did it. We got closer from it. When I met my first wife, Melissa, I just knew that she was going to be a very important part of my life. Even though those of you who were at the table this morning, I mentioned how I knew it immediately. But then it was many years later after we were married, and we were talking with some friends, and they asked, well, how did you know? And of course I said, I knew it immediately. And we had been together 5 years, and then we got married after 5 years, and we'd been together at least 5, maybe 7 years after that. And she said, after about 7 years. I thought, what? We had at least been married 2 years, and you still weren't sure? And so I've had that relationship. Yeah. But I've been fortunate. It worked out. And with my friends, and even when I met Jasmine again, there was just an instant knowing. You know, there wasn't, I didn't have any issues. It was just like, well, it's a weird, transition that I'm going through, but there's a knowing, and it worked out. So I feel fortunate in that regard, but I think we can all kind of tap into that if we just simply allow ourselves to, if we allow ourselves to be open to that possibility. But also having discernment, because there were plenty of people that I met that I said, hell no, right? So you have to be able to not just take the first person that comes in, but also be able to recognize with discernment who might not be beneficial for you. So in a roundabout way, that's my answer. Okay, anything to say, Donelle?
So how do you know your guru? You have to want it, I think, as well. You have to really, want to have a teacher, really sort of put that out there and vibe it. And I'd been on the yoga path for quite some time, and I'd done teacher trainings, and I had some very important teachers along the way, and I'd kind of gone as far as I knew that I could in that line on my own, and I was just like, there was no one in my community that I could really sort of find, and I prayed and I begged and I cried, and I was like, please, I need someone to help me, take me to the next level. There it was. I got on and did a bit of a Google, and I found, and I did know straight away, and I followed some of the the YouTube teachings, and I went and I did a meditation, and I sat there and I had the Om straight away, and I was like, oh my God, it's real, and I was thinking, really? I'm like, this guy's not Indian, not even 40. He didn't have any kids. I thought probably lacked a little bit of life experience, and American, isn't it nice? And on YouTube, yeah. But I knew, I did know. So, how do you know? You know when you know. And how important is it? Very, very important. Very important. It stops that spiritual shopping, that seeking everywhere, looking, trying to find it, not really knowing, having a stabilizing path has been really important.
Just to add on what you said there, because when I met Roy, when I was in communication with Roy, I think I had an imagined version of how Roy was living his life, because we were communicating, and what he was offering was very sincere, very practical, very useful. He was being very generous in what he was offering me, sending me literature from the United States over to Europe. When I was preparing to go to CSA, I got an email back from Willie Davis. So Roy is Roy Eugene Davis. So Willie Davis, I said, that must be his sister. And then when I arrived in CSA, I realized that Willie Davis was Roy's wife. And that totally jarred with my whole perspective. You can't be married. You're supposed to be a yogi. So we have these frameworks of what we think makes a proper yogi or not a proper yogi, or a proper, the criteria, the checklist of what it means to be a teacher, and you need to pass my checklist. If you don't pass it, no. And sometimes that's all very superficial. I definitely know from my own experience it was very superficial. Because Roy, at the end of the day, they're people who are living in the world, and some people do take on the vow of celibacy, and some people do live as monastics. But in today's era, as we are becoming more and more able to experience space in our lives where we don't have to trudge and toil in ways where it's taking up all our time, we have more space. We don't need to seclude ourselves from society in the same way. We don't need to have ourselves living the life of a recluse without having relationships that are meaningful to us. We can still have all of that. But at the time, I didn't see that. And I was measuring Roy by that. So I think we have to be careful how we measure the people, because really it's about the teaching. And if they're offering this teaching sincerely, they're living by it, and it makes sense how they're delivering it to you, that's kind of what it takes.